It was already late when he finally stepped out, the air sharp and clean after the storm. He stood on the damp porch of his cottage, watching the beam of the old light slice through the lingering mist. The rain had stopped, but the entire world still felt drenched, heavy, quiet, and profoundly alone. He was waiting for the sound of tires on gravel, but only the low, steady murmur of the Merrimack River answered, a sound that lately felt less like company and more like a reminder of the things that kept flowing away. He knew, with a certainty that sat like a stone in his gut, that the silence he craved after a long day of work was a lie. It wasn't peace, it was merely an absence. And tonight, that absence felt unbearable. If you've ever waited for something, a call, a sign, a moment that changes everything, then you know this space he occupies right now. It is vulnerable, and it is entirely real. Stay with us. Something important waits at the end of this quiet story. Take a moment to hit the like button for Jake and share this chapter with someone who understands the weight of a long wait. Hey dear, welcome to Hearts Entangled, a gentle corner for love, healing, and the quiet stories we rarely find the courage to voice. If soft, lingering tales about human connection mean something to you, then you're exactly where you belong. So before we dive in, do me a small kindness. Hit subscribe, tap the like button, and maybe hold something warm between your palms. This story wants you to feel with it. Because today's story might be the reminder your heart didn't realize it was waiting for. Now, let's begin. Jake Thorne, 28 years old and sturdy in the shoulders, was built for reliable things, fixing plumbing, troubleshooting wires, wrestling with the heavy cast iron stoves that dotted old Lowell, Massachusetts. He had inherited his grandfather's cottage, a place with faded siding and a porch that always groaned when he walked across it, but it was his. It was paid for with the last of his grandfather's savings, a stability Jake valued more than any career trajectory. His work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far back to the recent past. 4 years ago, he'd dropped out of community college, realizing the pressure of loans and the anonymity of lecture halls weren't for him. It was simple, honest labor that kept the heat on and his hands calloused. The only serious relationship he'd had ended 6 months prior, when his fiancée left a note that read, "I need more than potential." It was a blunt assessment of his lack of a 5-year plan, and he hadn't blamed her. He still kept the spare key to her old apartment in a drawer, a small polished piece of copper next to a stack of bills he was chipping away at $20 at a time. The house, after she left, had stretched to twice its size, vast and cold with predictable silence. That silence was violently interrupted by the memory of the phone call from last night. It had come from a number he didn't recognize, tagged with the address The Glass House, 30th floor. A tower of steel and glass, new construction, the kind of place where residents paid more for the view than he made in a year. "Hi, this is Vivian Caldwell from 30A. I have a serious leak behind the main wall. It's getting worse. Can you come tonight?" Jake had wanted to refuse. It was almost 10 and the rain was brutal, but the rigid control in her voice had been undercut by a sliver of desperation he couldn't ignore. He'd thrown his tools in the back of the truck and driven through sheets of water to the glowing monolith at the edge of the city. The apartment had been stunning, all open plan, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the churning Merrimack. Yet it was empty. Not unfinished, but empty. No personal photos, no books, no evidence of life. Just a single leather sofa and a glass coffee table where a bottle of red wine breathed beside a single, unused glass. Vivian Caldwell herself was just as controlled, still in the charcoal suit she'd probably worn to whatever boardroom meeting had wrecked her day. She was taller than he expected, carrying herself with an air of brittle exhaustion. The leak was exactly where she said. He'd set his toolbox down, rolled up his sleeves, and worked, the only sounds the clink of his wrench and the rain hammering the glass. She had stayed across the room, perched on a bar stool, staring at her phone like it might bite her. When the drip stopped, Jake stood up, wiping his hands. He couldn't help but glance around the vast, silent space. "Nice place," he'd offered. "Must be quiet up here." "Too quiet," she had replied, so softly it was barely a whisper. He knew he should have left, grabbed his payment, and gone home, but something in the way those two words hung in the sterile air, heavy with years of unspoken weight, made him pause. "You live alone?" he'd asked. She gave a short, bitter laugh. "As of last week, yes." Then, for reasons he still couldn't fathom, maybe it was the wine on her breath, or the way the apartment felt like a museum, or maybe just the sheer weariness of his own empty rooms, he said it. "Well, if it ever feels too big, you could always crash at my place. It's cramped, the porch leaks, and the neighbor's dog barks at 3 a.m., but at least someone talks back." He had meant it as a stupid, awkward joke, a throwaway line to cut the tension. He even laughed, too loud in the silent space. She hadn't laughed back. She had simply looked at him with an intensity that filed the joke away, like a promise. He'd given her his card and escaped into the elevator. By the time he got home, soaked and shivering, he had done his best to forget the exchange. But now, standing on his porch the next morning, smelling the wet leaves and the distant scent of coffee, he couldn't forget. Because the sound of tires he was waiting for wasn't the river's murmur, it was the crunch of expensive tires on his gravel driveway. Then, there she was. Vivian Caldwell stood on his porch, drenched, a small black suitcase at her feet. Her hair was loose now, wet strands clinging to her cheeks, and she wore jeans and a cream sweater that had seen better days. Her eyes were wide, determined, and just a little terrified. "Your offer," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Does it still stand?" He stared at her, barefoot in the doorway, rain dripping from the eaves onto his toes. She swallowed. "I don't have anywhere else I want to be." Jake stood aside, muttering, "Come in before you catch pneumonia." She hesitated only for a second, then crossed the threshold. The floorboards of his old cottage groaned under her boots, boots that looked like they'd never seen mud until today. She set the suitcase down gently, like she was afraid it might bruise the floor. "I can pay rent," she said, pulling a white envelope from her coat pocket. 3 weeks, cash, that's all I need. Quiet. A place to think. He rubbed the back of his neck, still half convinced this was a dream. "You don't have to pay." She placed the envelope on the counter. 5 crisp $100 bills. "I'm not here for charity." Jake looked at the money, then at her steady, almost defiant eyes. "Fine. Guest room is down the hall. It's basic." She nodded, picked up the suitcase, and disappeared around the corner. The door clicked shut. Then nothing. No footsteps, no unpacking, just the soft patter of lingering rain on the roof. The money sat on the counter. The price of quiet, the cost of the silence he had just traded away. The first week, they were ghosts in the same house, 2 separate spirits occupying parallel lives beneath the same leaky roof. Jake would leave before dawn for jobs that left his boots caked in mud, Mrs. Lang's sluggish dishwasher, the bakery's temperamental grease trap, a rental on Elm Street with a toilet that refused to stop its endless quiet running. He'd come home after dark and the kitchen light would be on, casting a warm, uneven glow over the clutter. On the stove, beneath a covering of silver foil, he would find food, chicken and rice, a perfectly layered lasagna. Once a steak so flawlessly seared, so utterly unlike anything he cooked, that he almost cried from the sheer effort behind the anonymous gesture. There was never a note, just the offering of sustenance. Vivian stayed mostly in the guest room. He'd hear the shower running at odd hours, the quiet creak of the floorboards when she paced in the evening. Sometimes, if he passed the door, he'd catch a glimpse of her through the crack, curled on the small bed with a book, hair loose and soft, wearing one of his old flannel shirts. Her own clothes, he realized, were all dry clean only. Without the severe suit, she looked smaller, younger, and utterly unmoored. They did not talk, not really. A mumbled good morning if they passed in the narrow hall, a quiet thanks for the food over coffee that Jake made too strong. He slept on the sofa, the blanket pulled up to his chin, pretending the tight lump in his throat was just the draft from the old window. But the house began to change, quietly, subtly, around the edges of his life. One morning, he came downstairs to find the pile of bills, which he usually ignored until the envelopes felt shameful, neatly stacked with a rubber band around them. The takeout containers were gone. The sink sparkled, not merely clean, but actually gleaming. He opened the fridge out of habit and saw groceries. Not the haphazard bachelor selection he was used to, but real groceries.
eggs, milk, a bag of crisp green apples, and a six-pack of the specific IPA he liked, the one he hadn't bought in months because of the cost. Again, no note, no explanation, just proof that she was watching, observing, and taking action. That evening, he finally gathered the courage to knock on her door. She opened it just a crack, eyes wary, ready for confrontation. "You don't have to clean up after me," he said, holding his ground. "I appreciate the cooking, but you don't need to do the rest." "I know," she replied simply, paused, then offered, "It helps me think." He nodded, not sure how to process that his life, his mess, was somehow a calming puzzle for her high-functioning mind. The flannel shirt she wore was buttoned low, the sleeves rolled up. "The flannel looks good on you," he said before he could stop himself. She glanced down, a hint of pink rising in her cheeks. "It was in the dryer." "Keep it." She gave him a tiny, almost involuntary smile, then closed the door. Jake stood there for a long time, listening to the soft patter of rain outside. He realized with a small internal jolt that she hadn't mentioned the money on the counter. She was cleaning and cooking not to pay a debt, but to fill a void. The days bled into the second week. The silence didn't vanish, but it softened. Jake came home one evening to the rich, complex smell of garlic and rosemary. Vivian was at the stove, sleeves rolled up, stirring something with fierce concentration in his grandmother's old, heavy cast-iron skillet. Her hair was down, curling slightly at the ends from the steam, a few loose strands clinging to her neck. She didn't turn when he walked in. "Hope you're hungry," she said. "I made too much." Jake dropped his heavy toolbox by the door. Starving. They ate at the table that night, using real plates, not paper. She'd found the cloth napkins he'd kept tucked away for Thanksgiving. The chicken was tender, the potatoes crisp. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was easy, companionable. After dinner, she washed, he dried. Their hands brushed over a warm ceramic plate. Neither of them moved away immediately. "You sing when you think no one's listening," he broke the quiet. She froze, the sponge mid-scrub. "You heard that?" "Fleetwood Mac, Landslide," he confirmed. "You've got a good voice."
She laughed, soft, surprised, the sound echoing slightly in the small kitchen. "I haven't sung in years." That night, he heard her again through the thin wall. Not loud, just enough to carry. He lay on the sofa, his eyes open in the dark, listening to the notes drift like smoke. The house was still cold, still creaking, but the air around him was warmer. The ghost had begun to take substance, and Jake realized, quietly, that he was no longer alone. The sound of Landslide had finally faded, leaving the house quiet again, but the silence was now a velvet thing, no longer sharp and unforgiving. Jake lay there, tracing the familiar lines of the sofa fabric, realizing the lump in his throat wasn't from a draft or a lack of connection, but from the sudden, powerful knowledge that he was sharing his life, his small, quiet orbit, with someone else. The third week saw the house transform from a silent sanctuary for two loners into something genuinely shared. The envelope of cash remained untouched on the counter, pushed behind the cereal box like a forgotten relic. The transaction was over. The connection had begun. Jake came home one Tuesday evening to find the flickering lamp in the living room, the old brass one his grandfather swore was vintage, but which had been unreliable for years, shining with a steady, warm glow. He walked around the corner and found Vivian on the floor, legs crossed, surrounded by his toolbox contents, wire strippers, electrical tape, and a small soldering iron he hadn't used in a decade. "Figured you'd blow a fuse eventually," she said without looking up, twisting a cap onto a fresh wire. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, the loose flannel shirt sleeves rolled precisely to her elbows. "This thing was a fire hazard, Jake." He dropped his keys into the bowl. "You didn't have to." She clicked the lamp on and off, testing it. The light was clean, strong, and dependable. "I wanted to," she admitted, finally looking up. "It was crooked in its wiring. I couldn't stand it." He crouched beside her, watching her precision as she packed the tools back into his box, placing each wrench and screwdriver into its designated foam slot. She moved with an innate efficiency, the same focus he applied to sealing a pipe joint or leveling a difficult toilet flange. "You're good with your hands," he observed. She gave a small, distant smile, wiping a smudge of copper dust from her chin. "Used to build furniture prototypes before the boardrooms, high-end, custom pieces, muscle memory." She tightened the latch on the toolbox. Her nails were short and clean now, the diamond studs that had dominated her ears on that first night gone, replaced by small, plain gold hoops that caught the lamplight when she moved. She wasn't the woman from the glass house anymore. She was here. That night, they ate at the table again, real plates and silverware. She cooked a complex risotto, stirring the arborio rice for 40 minutes, nursing a bottle of white wine she'd unearthed from the back of his pantry. The fan above them, fixed by Jake earlier that day, spun lazily, pushing warm air in slow circles. Vivian began to talk about her past, not in corporate jargon, but in human fragments. She spoke about her ex-husband, how he had proposed with a string quartet, but how he had stopped looking at her across the dinner table long before he asked for the divorce. "The last time we spoke," she recalled, staring into her wine glass, he said, "You're not the woman I married," like it was a failing that I had changed. Jake told her about his own past, about Jenna, the note, the key, the way he had sat on the porch after she left, staring at the empty driveway until the cold dawn forced him inside, paralyzed by the feeling of being permanently stalled. They didn't cry, they didn't offer advice or comforting lies. They simply sat there, the risotto cooling on their plates, the fan humming, the air thick with the humidity of shared confession. The quiet wasn't empty, it was full of understanding. Later, they walked down to the river. The path was slick with wet leaves, the water black and glassy under the distant streetlights. Vivian wore his old denim jacket, the sleeves rolled 3 times. Their arms swung in rhythm, their knuckles grazed every few steps. It was a dance of proximity, a testing of boundaries neither of them dared to name. She stopped at the bench by the old mill, worn smooth by years of weather. "I used to run here," she said, pulling the jacket closer, "before the collapse. 5 miles every morning. I thought if I just kept moving, nothing could ever catch me." Jake sat beside her. "And now?" "Now," she whispered, looking out at the dark water, "now I'm standing still." She turned to him, the faint light catching the surprising wetness in her eyes. "And it doesn't feel like falling." He didn't speak. He reached over slowly, brushed a wet leaf from her loose hair. She leaned into the touch, only slightly, but enough to close the distance. Her hand found his on the bench, fingers threading through his without hesitation, an ancient, instinctual connection. They stayed like that until the cold crept through the denim and the flannel, holding the shared silence like a promise. Back home, she made real cocoa, milk, dark chocolate, a pinch of chili, and they drank it on the porch, wrapped in the same thick wool blanket. The rain had entirely stopped, and the air smelled clean and sharp. She rested her head on his shoulder, a weight so natural he felt his own shoulders relax for the first time in months. He didn't move. Inside, the house felt profoundly different. The walls had acquired stories. The kitchen table held the scars of her knives. The hallway smelled of her lavender soap and his sawdust. The guest room door stayed cracked open. His boots lived in the hall. The envelope of cash remained on the counter, forgotten, a relic of a time when their life together was merely a transaction. The feeling of mine had quietly, beautifully eroded, leaving behind something that felt undeniably like ours. By the time the 3rd week bled into the 4th, the small, observant town of Lowell had certainly started to notice. Gossip travels faster than the Merrimack in a thaw, and a woman like Vivian Caldwell, tall, polished, driving a silver Audi that looked utterly out of place on Jake's gravel driveway, could not go unseen. Mrs. Dubois, the neighbor from 2 houses down, cornered Jake at his mailbox one raw November morning, her curiosity bright and unforgiving despite the early hour. "That's your girlfriend, Ethan?" she asked, her eyebrow raised so high it nearly touched her curler.
The one with the fancy car? Jake fumbled with the junk mail. Just a friend, renting the spare room. Mrs. Dubois eyed his still-soaked work boots. Friends don't cook dinner every night and fix your porch light, Jake. Friends don't leave the smell of fancy soap on your clothes. He muttered something about plumbing discounts and a shared love of architecture and escaped inside, his cheeks warm. Vivian was at the kitchen table, her laptop open, typing furiously. She looked up when he slammed the door slightly harder than intended. "Everything okay, neighbor?" she asked, a small knowing smirk playing on her lips. I tossed the mail onto the counter. "They think you're my sugar mama." She laughed, a short, surprised bark. "Let them, keeps the solicitors away." But the questions kept coming. Mr. Patel at the hardware store asked if he was finally settling down. The waitress at the diner slipped an extra pancake onto his plate and winked, "For the lady at home." Jake stopped correcting them. It was simpler than explaining something he didn't have words for, something that felt too delicate to be defined by a label. Vivian didn't care about the scrutiny. In fact, she began to deliberately lean into the small-town life. She started wearing Jake's oldest, baggiest hoodies to the grocery store, her hair in a messy bun, wearing no makeup. She waved at Mrs. Dubois like they were old pals. She even spent an afternoon helping Mr. Patel carry mulch to his truck, coming home with dirt smeared under her short, neat nails. The town didn't know what to make of the Glass House woman, but they liked her effort anyway.
Inside the cottage, the lines of ownership blurred further. Her toothbrush lived next to his. Her black wool coat hung on the hook by the door, displacing his worn Carhartt jacket. The guest room bed stayed made, the corners tight, but she hadn't slept in it for weeks. They didn't talk about it. They simply moved like planets, adjusting their orbits without noticing the gravity, settling into a shared routine. One Tuesday in November, Jake came home to find the small hallway rug, the one that had been crooked since he'd moved in, perfectly recentered. She'd even vacuumed the worn edges. He didn't say anything. He just poured her a strong cup of coffee before heading out to a job in the next town over. The habits piled up like snow against the windows. She started leaving the bathroom door slightly ajar when she showered, the steam curling into the hall, the faint scent of her lavender soap mixing with the pine cleaner he used on the floors. He'd catch himself pausing outside, listening to the water, then shake his head and keep moving. He left his work gloves on the radiator to dry. She moved them to the hook by the door without comment. Then the call came. It was a bitterly cold Tuesday. Jake was under the sink at the bakery, elbow deep in grease, when his phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. When he finally crawled out, hands blackened, there were 7 missed calls from an unknown number and a long voicemail. He wiped his hands on a rag and played the message on speaker. "Miss Hart, this is Victor Lang from the board. We need to discuss your resignation. The shareholders are extremely concerned. Your absence is affecting morale and stock price stability. We are prepared to offer you your old position, full authority, increased equity, but we need you back in the city now. Call me." Jake stared at the phone, his throat tight. He knew what that meant. He knew the money involved. He knew the weight of what she had abandoned. Vivian was in the living room, curled on the couch with a book. She hadn't heard the voicemail. That night, she didn't cook. She paced instead, phone to her ear, her voice low, sharp, and entirely corporate. He caught fragments: image, optics, liability, 6 figures. When she finally hung up, she stood at the window, staring at the dark, rushing river like it might give her an answer. "They want me back," she said finally. "Tomorrow, emergency meeting." Jake nodded, feeling the silence around him revert instantly to the sharp, cold thing it had been before she arrived. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely a rasp. She didn't answer. She simply turned off the light, walked down the hall, and went to bed. His bed, but she faced the wall. The space she had filled for weeks suddenly felt vast and empty again. The life she had run from had finally returned, demanding the full price of quiet. She was gone before the thin, gray light of dawn had fully filtered through the curtains. Jake woke to an unnerving stillness, the lack of movement in the house heavier than the deepest sleep. There was no smell of brewing coffee, no distant sound of her shower, just the hiss of the old radiator mocking him with its solitary complaint. He spent the day on agonizing autopilot, his mind a slow churning engine of dread. He fixed a difficult water heater in a greasy basement, the moldy smell clinging to his clothes. He replaced a broken faucet for a couple who argued endlessly over the exact shade of the granite counter. He drove home with the radio off, the silence inside the truck louder than the rumble of his engine. Every piece of his work was precise, manual, and physical, yet his focus was fragmented, fixed on the empty space he was driving toward. He got home just after 6. The sky was the color of wet slate, the river turning brown and fast under the fading light. The silver Audi wasn't in the driveway. The porch light, which she had insisted on keeping on every night, was dark. Jake sat in the truck for a long minute, keys dangling from his hand, staring at the empty gravel. Then he went inside.
The house smelled like nothing. No garlic, no coffee, no lavender soap. The envelope of cash was gone from the counter. The kitchen table had a note, not a post-it, but a full sheet folded once. He stood by the dim light of the flickering refrigerator bulb and opened it. Ethan. I took the 6 a.m. train. The board meeting is at 9. I don't know what I'll say yet. Thank you for the porch light. M. He read the words 3 times. They were careful, non-committal, and offered no comfort. He folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket, a flimsy relic of a momentous departure. He walked down the hall. The guest room door was open. The bed was made, the corners tucked tight and neat like a hotel preparing for its next temporary guest. Her books were gone. The flannel shirt she'd worn for weeks was folded perfectly on the chair, sleeves neat, buttoned at the top. He picked it up, held the soft material to his face. It smelled like her soap and his detergent, a painful, singular scent of their shared space. He set it back down. Jake didn't cry. He didn't pace. He went out to the porch and sat on the cold wooden steps where they had drunk cocoa, the blanket forgotten in the living room. The river was loud tonight, rushing over the rocks as if it too had somewhere urgent to be. He just sat there, hands in his lap, watching the dark, and waited. The cold crept in, a slow, biting pressure that seeped through his clothes, but he didn't move. Hours passed. The streetlights buzzed. A dog barked down the block. He thought about the first night she'd cooked, how she'd burned the garlic and laughed like it was the best mistake she'd ever made. He thought about the precision of her hands fixing the fan, the way she had confessed her heartbreak on the river bench. He thought about the space she had filled, not just in the house, but in him. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew, the porch light flickered on. He blinked, squinting against the sudden glow. The silver Audi was back, parked crookedly on the gravel as if she'd pulled in too fast. The driver's door opened. Vivian stepped out. No heels, no suit, just jeans, his old denim jacket, her hair loose and wild in the damp air. She had a paper bag in one hand and something small and bright in the other. She looked utterly exhausted, like she'd aged a year and a day, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. I couldn't do it, she said, her voice raw. The meeting? Jake asked. I didn't go. She walked up the steps slowly, deliberately. I got to the station, bought a ticket, stood on the platform, and then I thought about the way you leave the coffee pot half full so I don't have to make it in the morning, and the way you hum when you're fixing something, and the way this house smells like sawdust and time and home. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the tear tracks on her cheeks, close enough that he could smell the damp wool of his jacket. He reached into her jacket pocket. It was the small, polished copper key he'd given her on a whim that first week, the spare key to Jenna's old apartment. She held it up, bright in the porch light. I called Victor from the platform, told him I'm done, not resigning, done. They can keep the corner office and the equity. I'm keeping this. His hand shook as he took the key from her. It felt heavy, substantial, a symbol of a choice that redefined her life. You sure? He asked. She nodded, the certainty in her eyes stronger than any corporate title. I've never been more sure of anything. Jake stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her close. This time, she leaned back into him fully, her head settling perfectly beneath his chin. Her hands covered his, clutching the denim of his jacket. The house woke up. The radiator gave a satisfied hiss. The refrigerator hummed its low, steady tune. The porch light buzzed like it was happy to be on again.
She turned in his arms, facing him, her eyes searching his. "I'm not good at this," she admitted. "At staying, at choosing messy over perfect." "Me neither," he said, and the admission felt like the most honest promise he'd ever made. She smiled, small, real, and a little defiant. "Then we'll figure it out together." They stood there for a long time, the river moving on, the cold biting at their exposed skin, but the space between them was gone. It had been filled completely with the weight of their choice. Later, she cooked. Eggs. She wore his old t-shirt, pulled the flannel over it, and burned the toast, turning the kitchen airs smoky and slightly panicked. She laughed, loud and genuine, when he scraped the black off with a knife. They ate at the table, the chipped ceramic plates full of imperfect eggs, their knees touching under the wood. The fan spun lazily overhead. The house smelled like butter and coffee and the lingering scent of rain. They didn't talk about forever. They didn't make promises about their 5-year plan. They didn't need to. The simple, solid reality of her presence was the only promise that mattered. The suitcase stayed in the hall, unpacked, now merely a piece of luggage, not a looming threat of departure. The flannel shirt stayed on the chair, ready for tomorrow. The copper key stayed in Jake's pocket, a warm, heavy weight against his thigh. The 3rd week had turned into a month, and the month turned into the long, slow turn toward winter. The town still talked. Mrs. Dubois still asked questions. The board still sent emails, which Vivian deleted without reading. But the house was warm. The porch light stayed on. Some nights they still walked to the river, their hands linked now, moving in a rhythm of comfort. Some mornings Jake still left the coffee pot half full. Some evenings she still sang Landslide when she thought he wasn't listening. And every morning, Jake woke to the sound of someone else's breathing beside him, the distinct, steady rhythm of a woman who had nowhere else she wanted to be. It wasn't because they had fixed each other. It was because in the quiet, dusty, imperfect confines of his small cottage, they had chosen to stop running. They had chosen to stand still, together. They had chosen to accept their beautiful, complicated flaws, and that, finally, was enough.